Welcome to the LBF Church Podcast, where we talk about topics that help us grow in our affection towards Jesus and also grow more equipped to follow him as he leads us. I'm Dan Franklin, and this is going to be the second episode where I'm going to talk about the subject of justice. Now, there may be several more of these that we end up going through. I just want to say, if you haven't listened to the previous episode about justice, I want to encourage you to do that because that may kind of set the tone for this. But the specific way that I want to talk about justice today is how it applies to who we believe when there's something that's in dispute, when there's one person who's made a claim or one person who's made an accusation and somebody else who's made a denial, how we sort through the justice of who we believe. Now, just as a disclaimer, so right now, if you're following the news, there's obviously a big application of this when it comes to the Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh. So we're recording this on September 25th, and a week from now, we'll actually post this episode. By then, there may have been a lot more developments because there's at least a couple of accusers that are accusing Brett Kavanaugh of things from about 35 years ago that happened. He's categorically denying it. So as a nation right now, we are kind of struggling with this. Who do you believe? Do you believe the accuser? Do you believe the denial? I just wanted to say that because if you're listening to this in the aftermath of all this, there may be more things that come out that you think, why isn't he talking about this? It's because it hasn't happened yet. But I want to start just with the establishing of the biblical idea of justice. So the biblical idea of justice has to do at its core with the idea of equality. And specifically, it has to do with the idea of equal treatment. Now, it's important just to clarify, equal treatment does not mean equal results. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to have the same amount of money. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to have success. In the same way, just at a basic level, justice happens sometimes where people walk away from a court case and somebody goes to jail and somebody's exonerated. So justice, when it comes to equality, does not mean that there are equal results or equal outcomes, but it does mean that there's equal treatment no matter your race, no matter your gender, no matter your age, no matter whether you're rich or poor. And just to establish this, some of the key passages, going back to the Old Testament, Exodus chapter 23, verses 2 and 3, do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd, and do not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit. So this is interesting because we think of the rich as the ones who show favoritism by favoring the rich and excluding the poor. The author, Moses, is going to talk about that in a minute in the next passage that I read. But it's interesting because the scenario that he paints here is seemingly the idea that there's a rich person who's been accused and the crowd of poor people are just saying, well, he's rich, let's get him. And Moses says, don't go along with the crowd. That would be unjust. That would be unequal treatment. Similarly, just in verses 6 and 7, a few verses later, he says, do not deny justice to your poor people in their lawsuits. Have nothing to do with the false charge. And do not put an innocent or honest person to death, for I will not acquit the guilty. So there we have the establishment of equality. The equality is not that when you have a lawsuit, things turn out the same for both people. That's basically impossible. Equality is not that everybody has the exact same amount of money. Equality is not that people all live in the same house. Equality is that people are treated the same by the law. And when it comes to this whole idea of who we believe, you even heard witnesses referred to in these passages that I just read, that there's a lot of implications for this. One of them is certainly in our legal system, to say, is our legal system set up in such a way that we are just in giving equal weight to the people who make different claims or serve as witnesses. At the same time, this can go far beyond the legal realm because we might think, well, I'm not a judge or I'm not a person on a jury. How can I exercise justice? It also applies to situations in our everyday lives to say, if you're an employer of other people, how do you practice justice in what you believe when there's different claims by your employees? And maybe both are claiming to take credit for an idea and you have to sort through who did it or who did the work so that you determine who gets the reward, or you've got to determine whose fault something is so you can determine who gets reprimanded or who gets fired. It applies to those of us who are parents when we think of disputes with our kids and which one are we going to believe and which one are we going to disbelieve, which one are we going to punish, all those sorts of things. It comes to even issues with friends where we might think, well, it's not a justice issue. I'm not throwing anybody into prison, but how are we interacting with our friends when there's some sort of dispute and we're choosing who to believe? Are we treating them with justice, or are we simply siding with the person who's convenient to us? And one of the reasons why it's important to talk about this is I think it's pretty indisputable that it's not simply a matter that we as people look at a question and automatically go towards the objective evidence to decide who we are going to believe. Most of us walk into situations with a stake in it. We walk into situations and we already have somebody that we want to believe. And then we typically look for evidence to back that up. It's very rare that we walk into a situation and say, I'm just going to stay objective until I hear all the evidence. And yet that's what justice calls for. So I want to read a couple passages, again, from the Old Testament. This will be from Deuteronomy, that just as the Jewish nation was being established, ways that God set things up in order for justice to reign in the land. So this is Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15, talking about the whole idea of witnesses in a lawsuit. It says, one witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of any crime or offense they may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, I'm going to say more about this, but this is a really interesting starting point, and this is peppered throughout the Old Testament. This was a big part of the Jewish legal system that God had set up to say one witness is not enough. You hear Jesus alluding to this at different times in the New Testament in kind of a metaphorical way to talk about the God bearing witness to him and to his ministry. But this whole idea is, all right, so you've got a situation and you've got only one witness. This is where you really do have a he said, or a she said, or whatever. You got one person saying this happened, the person who's accused saying this didn't happen. And the way that the law is set up is to say that one witness is not enough. Now, I want you just to pause and think about this for a moment. Now, in the United States, we have in our legal system the concept of innocent until proven guilty. And the whole idea there is that if somebody is accused, the burden of proof is on the accuser, or the burden of proof is on the state, or the burden of proof is on the prosecutors to demonstrate guilt. You start by saying, I'm going to assume this person didn't do it. You've got to prove to me that they did. Now, you may say, well, that's the United States. That's not the Bible. And you're exactly right. That's the United States. That's not the Bible. But what is given here in this Deuteronomy passage, that one witness is not enough, in some ways goes right along with that concept. I remember serving on I didn't serve on a jury. I've never served on a jury. For some reason, they never picked me. But the one time I got closest to serving on a jury, I was on a panel and the lawyers were instructing us as potential jurors. And one of it was the defense attorney, said to all of us, our legal system is predicated on the idea that we would rather have a guilty person get released than to have an innocent person put in jail. And so it ends up that we have to be okay with the idea that sometimes guilty people are going to get away with it. And then he asked us all, are you okay with that? And I just remember in my head thinking, well, no, I'm not okay with that. That's great. Who's okay with that? Who's okay with the idea of guilty people getting exonerated? I'm not okay with that. And at the same time, I was realizing, all right, given the choices, yes. Given the choices, I would rather err on the side of having a guilty person get away with it than having an innocent person end up being convicted of something. That seems to be the way that God establishes the nation of Israel. Because you just know that there are going to be cases where there aren't other witnesses. There are going to be cases where there's one person who brings an accusation and they're right. They know that this happened. They witnessed this happening, but nobody else is around. And the way the legal system is set up is in that case, the person gets away with it. In that case, you can't bring the charge against the person because one witness is not enough. The way that God established this was that we would rather let a guilty person get away with it than convict an innocent person. In fact, this is so severe that if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 17, this is spoken of again, and it's spoken of in the context of witnesses being brought into a case. I'll read Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 6 and 7, where it says, on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a person is to be put to death. So this in a capital case. But no one is to be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. The hands of the witness must be the first in putting that person to death, and then the hands of all the people. You must purge the evil from among you. So this just ratchets things up, that the way Israel was set up, all right, first of all, you need more than one witness. Secondly, if you're going to be one of those witnesses, you better be so certain of it that you are willing to be the first to participate in the penalty, in the punishment. You don't just get to swoop in and say, this is what I saw, and then swoop out and let somebody else do the dirty work. You've got to be that sure of it. And to go along with it, for a witness that isn't sure of it, or a witness that is falsely doing something, here's what's said in the verses following. So this is back to Deuteronomy chapter 19. I already read verse 15, which has to do with the two witnesses. Verse 16 says, if a malicious witness takes the stand to accuse someone of a crime, the two people involved in the dispute must stand in the presence of the Lord before the priests and the judges who are in office at that time. The judge must make a thorough investigation, and if the witness proves to be a liar, giving false testimony against a fellow Israelite, then do to the false witness as that witness intended to do to the other party. You must purge evil from among you. The rest, this is key, the rest of the people will hear this and be afraid. And you say, be afraid of what? Be afraid of being a false witness. The rest will hear of this and be afraid, and never again will such an evil thing be done among you. Show no pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So here's the context of this. As God is establishing a nation and saying, we want justice to reign, he first of all says, one witness isn't going to cut it, even if they're right. And we recognize that there are going to be cases where this means that full justice isn't done because there are no other witnesses. But we're going to err on the side of letting somebody get away with it than convicting an innocent person. And then he says, if you're a witness, you better be so sure of it that you're willing to help carry out the punishment. And if you're a false witness, you don't just get a slap on the wrist, you don't just get laughed out of court, you end up getting the punishment that you tried to get for the person that you falsely accused. The stakes are high. Ultimately, all this is pointing towards the idea that we should be very, very careful in convicting somebody. All this is pointed towards the idea that there are high stakes in how we handle the question of who we believe. And now let's just take this to another level and take this to a higher level and remind ourselves, all right, when it comes to this whole question of who we believe, we all do typically have a stake in this issue. So when somebody is accused, many of us have an instinctive response. If you look at even the response of the things that are going on with Judge Kavanaugh in this hearing, it's pretty predictable. When the accusation came out, there were a bunch of people who all automatically found the accusation very believable. And there were a whole other group of people that found the accusation pretty fishy. And those two groups of people split exactly along party lines. There were a bunch of Democrats that said, this accusation is credible. And there were a bunch of Republicans that said, this accusation doesn't quite add up. You didn't have a group of people saying, I want to figure this out. You had one group of people saying, in essence, I kind of want this to be true. I want this to be true of Judge Kavanaugh because if this is true, then that means that we get to withdraw his nomination. And he had a whole other group of people that in essence said, we don't want this to be true. We don't want this to be true because this is our guy and we want to get him through to the Supreme Court. I want you just to think for a minute, because in our own country, we've had lots of times, at the very least in our past, where this has been something that's been present. In fact, in one of the great American novels, To Kill a Mockingbird, this is something that's put on display. When a black man named Tom Robinson is accused of rape, and the evidence, if you walk through, is just, it's very obviously made up. It's very obviously false. Atticus Finch gets up and defends him before the people and makes it absolutely obvious that these are false allegations against him. And the whole reason why he still ends up being convicted is because the people would rather believe that a black man committed this crime than that a white woman and a white man falsely accused him of this crime. You've got to pause and think about things and say, it's not just a matter of saying, who am I going to believe? It's a matter of saying, who do I want to believe? And when we're in a situation where we want justice to happen, that means we have to be the kinds of people that even if we're looking at it and saying, well, I'm a man and so I kind of want to believe men, or I'm a woman so I kind of want to believe women, or I'm white and I don't really want to, believe that the white guy was capable of this, or I'm black and I don't really want to believe that somebody that looks like me did this. We've got to set those things aside, just as it talked about in Exodus chapter 23. Don't go along with the crowd in order to show favoritism towards a poor person, and don't end up perverting justice towards that poor person just because they're not one of you. On the much broader scale, there's a passage in Proverbs that I think is just general wisdom for all of us, but not just wisdom for us, also justice for all of us. So this is Proverbs 18, verse 17. In a lawsuit, the first to speak seems right until someone comes forward and cross-examines. If we're going to be people of justice, we need to be willing to listen to people who aren't simply the ones who are on our side, who aren't simply the ones who look like us and who think like us and who have our same background. We need to be willing for the cross-examination. In fact, this is something that I try to do, not only with theological issues and issues that come to do with controversies in the Bible, but things that have to do with our society, where I say, all right, I kind of know where I already lean on this. I kind of know what I already believe about these kinds of things, but I want to listen to somebody else make the absolute best case. I want to hear the cross-examination, because if all you ever listen to are the people that you instinctively see as the people on your side, you will never be able to practice real justice in your actions or even in your thoughts, because the first side that you hear will seem right if they're never cross-examined. So even for us, when it comes to issues like public accusations against people, I think we do well, first of all, to start with the principle of saying, you know what, we're going to err on the side of giving people the grace to say, we're not simply going to jump to the conclusion of guilt without some more proof. But then it also means that we take the side of saying, as that proof starts to mount up, even if this is a person that we consider to be a part of our tribe, even this person is the same political party as we are, or the same age, or the same background, or even if this person is a believer, even if this person is a pastor, even if this person is my friend, first of all, I'm willing to, if the evidence presents itself, I'm willing to believe that even a person that I love is guilty. And I'm also willing to believe that even a person that I really detest is innocent. I'm not going to allow my background and my biases to blind my eyes to justice. Justice is about equality, and that means that I treat my friend and my enemy the same when it comes to accusations made against them and when it comes to who I'm going to believe. There's obviously a lot more to be said about the subject of justice, and this is unlikely to be the last time that the subject comes up in talking about all of these things. And here's the great hope. I said before, one of the things that the American justice system is predicated on is that there are going to be some guilty people that get away with it, and we have to live with that. And even the way that the justice system for the people of Israel was set up is, some people are going to get away with it because there's not more witnesses. Here's a great hope we have. Nobody ultimately gets away with it. There is a God who is the final judge. And so when we have that internal angst of saying, but I want to make sure the guilty don't go unpunished, God doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. And then even to take it a step further, the great hope that all of us have is the humility that comes when we realize we are among the guilty. God doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. We are among the guilty in all kinds of things that we've done in our lives. And the way for us as Christians that God chose not to leave the guilty unpunished is that he punished his own son in our place. So even when we do look at a guilty person, and even in some appropriate way when we rejoice that justice is done with them, we can also have the humility of realizing that's the same way that we go, and worse, if not for the great grace given to us by the God who punished the guilty by punishing the innocent in our place. Now, if you have questions about this episode or other episodes that we've done on the LBF Church podcast, you can just comment on this video. If you're watching the video, if you're not watching the video, if you're listening to the audio, you can go to lbf.church and click on the tab that says blog and podcast. And you can see the video and the article that goes along with this. Love questions, love feedback, love polite disagreement, and to engage on all those kinds of things. Or if there's a specific issue related to this question of justice that you would like to see an episode on, please go ahead and make that suggestion. And I'd love to see that and love to be able to take on things that are on your mind. You can also just subscribe and download the audio by searching for the LBF Church podcast. And if you do that, please do leave a rating or leave a review, because our mission here is to provide content that helps people grow in their affection towards Jesus and also grow more equipped to follow him as he leads us. So until next episode, I'm Dan Franklin, and this is the LBF Church Podcast.